Hello, I want to welcome everyone to the conversation today. We are talking about the situation of police, racial justice, and how that impacts the city of Chicago. We have an amazing array of scholars and activists. This program is hosted by the UIC Social Justice Initiative. I'm Barbara Ransby. I'm the director of the initiative, and I have with me Essence McDowell, who's going to say a little bit about SJI before we start our program. Essence, do you want to say a little bit about the Social Justice Initiative?
Sure. Thank you so much, Barbara, and welcome to everyone who's watching online today. I'm Essence McDowell, the Associate Director of Communications at the Social Justice Initiative. It's my pleasure to be online with you all today for what will be a dynamic conversation about the movement for Black Lives with our guest speakers. The Social Justice Initiative is a unit at the University of Illinois at Chicago that provides a bridge between UIC campus and Chicago's expansive communities through issues of social justice. Much of our work is centered on connecting scholarship and community engagement through programs, public events, as well as national and local convenings and conferences. A few of our program areas are the Pipeline to Justice Scholarship and Mentoring Program and the Social Justice Minor, housed in the UIC Gender and Women's Studies Department. And also this year, we're launching the Chicago Justice Gallery, which is formerly known as the Pop-Up Justice Art Gallery. The Chicago Justice Gallery will be an innovative exhibition space dedicated to presenting multidisciplinary art, scholarship, and public programming by artists who are committed to exploring issues of social justice. Our first exhibition is a collaboration with celebrated photographer and conceptual artist from Chicago's Inglewood neighborhood, Tanika Johnson. Given the current global and national circumstances, we'll be doing an online exhibition opening until we're able to come together in a physical space. You can visit the SJI website for more details. It's sji.uic.edu, and we'll have the website link in the chat box and also below the video live streamed on our YouTube page. I know you all are looking forward to hearing the thoughts and ideas that our dynamic panelists have, so I'll hand it back over to Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you, Essence. Well, this is quite a historic moment. I'm a historian by training, so we say that a lot, but this time is for real. We have seen protests from one end of this country to the other. We have seen more sustained protests than at any time in the 1960s, which we think of as the kind of epicenter, the kind of historical epicenter of protests in the 20th century. I think the spring of 2020 will be marked by future historians as a real catalyst for change in the early 21st century. All of that has been triggered by police murders and police violence. The murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, of course, the most well-known of those, but also Breonna Taylor in Louisville and Tony McDade in Florida and Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. All of these names have become known to us now because they were victims, and most recently, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta just the other night. But they represent so many other victims. So, what we've seen is people in tens of thousands, from LA to New York to Chicago, engaged in massive protests in response to this racial violence. But it's not just police violence. There are a range of demands and issues that are interconnected that have sparked the kind of anger and the kind of rage and the kind of determined opposition that we see in the streets. We are fortunate today to have from Chicago's vast community of activists and leaders and organizers and artists, four of my favorite Chicago women, amazing forces for change in so many ways. And we're going to hear from them and engage in conversation. And we'll go for about an hour in our conversation, and then we'll be graced with the amazing talent of Jamila Woods, who is a Chicago-based artist of international reputation, who sings about the experiences in her life, in our communities, and really sings for justice. So we'll be wonderfully delighted, I'm sure, to hear her powerful voice at the end of this conversation. So I want to start off by asking a kind of open-ended question and asking our three panelists. We have Renee Hatcher, who is a law professor at the UIC's John Marshall School of Law, also an activist in the co-op movement. We have Trina Reynolds-Tyler, who works with the Invisible Institute and also with many activist groups in the city. And we have Kristiana Cologne with her beautiful child, Ori. Kristiana is a playwright, an artist, and a member of the Let Us Breathe collective. So that's our crew today. And I want to just start off asking you, maybe I'll start with you, Kristiana. What is your take on this historic moment? Police violence has been the catalyst for the protests. You've been involved in some of the protests here in Chicago. Why are people so angry in this moment, and why has the protest been so vast and so consistent and persistent? What do you think the significance is?
Thank you, Barbara. I think that this moment is special because it comes out of unprecedented global circumstances of pandemic. I didn't think I would ever see in my lifetime a shelter-in-place order or, capitalism responding the way that it did and contracting the way that it did in response to the coronavirus. And I think it also revealed what we all knew about the vast structural inequities in this country and just how vulnerable Black and Brown communities are and how vulnerable poor communities are across all social systems, particularly healthcare, but also housing. And then also, that people in cages and people being incarcerated is a public health crisis and you can't social distance in jail. And so with, I think, record unemployment, and then witnessing the extreme social transformation that happened in response to the coronavirus. We thought that we couldn't all work from home, and then we figured out a way to do that, right? So I think both the intensity of how dire the situation was with the coronavirus, what it revealed about social inequities, but then also what it revealed about social transformation and possibility, and how we can overnight make decisions to do something else, do something better for people if we put our imagination to it.
Right, and then the $1 trillion that became available in the coronavirus sort of suggests that the limited sense of possibility that we're always sold, really is a bill of goods, right? Trina, do you have anything to add to that, or what's your take? I know you're speaking to us from a food distribution site, so just that idea of mutual aid and people stepping up in this moment, you kind of embody that in the work that you do. What do you think this moment, both of the convergence of these crises and the current wave of protests, what's the significance of it?
So to me, I think that a lot of people have been sitting on the energy from 2014, 2015. And I think this moment right now is in relationship with that. I think a lot of people were trying to maybe make excuses for for policing and for police. A lot of people were awakened or began to think about the institution of policing in 2014 and in 2015, and we're thinking in a very reformist way. And I think that this moment, including the response to coronavirus, people have essentially seen that reform is not the answer. And I think a lot of people have been saying these things. A lot of people have been experiencing some of the things that has become more and more heightened now that coronavirus is a part of our daily lives. And I think people are now more and more aware of the fact that reform is just simply not the answer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, because a lot of things have changed. I mean, Mariam Kaba, our own, Chicago's own Mariam Kaba had a really powerful piece in the New York Times, an op-ed on Sunday, which kind of laid out the case for defunding the police and talked about the whole history of that as you're suggesting. So Renee Hatcher, thanks for being with us. What are some of your thoughts on this question? It's just really sharing your thoughts about this moment to set the stage for a conversation. What do you think the significance is? What has been some of the impetus for it, from your perspective as a lawyer, but also somebody who's doing solidarity economies, and we'll get more into the economic aspect in a minute.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what Kristiana and Trina said, right? Like this moment, the conditions that led us to this moment are unprecedented in many ways, just simply in terms of how the pandemic has affected us. And I think one of the things, it's not just in the wake of the pandemic, so many people are unemployed. Obviously, we have experienced tremendous loss, particularly in the Black community here in Chicago. 70% of the deaths have been Black folks. Disproportionately so, right? And I think that the pandemic really exposed the failure of neoliberalism, of divestment from public services. We've seen that in our healthcare system. We've seen how globalization actually leaves us out to dry when we actually need things to protect life, right? Just in terms of thinking about the fact that there are no manufacturers left who were willing to make PPE, or the fact that we have completely built a food system that actually allows for people to go hungry or for shelves to go empty in our grocery stores because of the way in which we've structured our economy. And so in many ways, at least to me, I think the pandemic exposed so many failures and the reasons why the economy doesn't make sense for the protection of life, for people, for communities, and has all been built around this idea to maximize profit. And never so clearly have we seen what the results are of that. I think that it pushed this conversation where people were talking about the trade-offs between unabated economic growth and people's lives, which is something that is real in every moment, far before the pandemic, right? Like we make decisions about this economy every day that actually cost people their lives. And it pushed that conversation in a very explicit way. And one of the things that I think is particular about this moment is also, I think that we needed all of the work that we did, in prior iterations to actually be at this moment, to be ready at this moment, but also to be in a position where folks are willing to reimagine and dream about what we can put in its place, and not just in the place of police, but how we can fundamentally shift and restructure society so communities can be safe, so people can thrive, so people can have what they need. And I think a lot of the mutual aid, a lot of the food giveaways, we saw that in a moment of crisis, it was really us who take care of us. It was community. It was power building. It was grassroots organizations on the ground who stepped in when people needed food, or when folks needed, access to groceries, and people stepped up and organized different kinds of mutual aid support. And so I think we've seen the failure of our government in lots of ways, and more or less like what the political structure and the political elites will actually do for us in these moments of crisis. And that in itself, I think, has pushed people to dream what's possible and what we can build. And that has at least—
we've seen, we've seen, these sort of two responses, which are often the case. The mutual aid, like when communities and individuals and families and neighborhoods feel abandoned, there's enormous creativity and common, contributing to the common good among ordinary people. At the same time, I'm hearing people are not letting the government off the hook, right? That the government does owe communities and owes Black people a lot, but certainly, the basic resources that we need, and sort of bodily autonomy and dignity and so forth. And so that is owed, even though in some ways, based on history, people aren't expecting it to be delivered without a fight. Kristiana, you were in Ferguson, and that kind of inspired your activism with the Let Us Breathe collective. You then were one of the organizers of Freedom Square, which protested another episode, another scandalous instance of police violence in the city at the Holman Square torture site that the Guardian newspaper exposed. Can you talk about the kind of trajectory of some of the work that you've been involved in that has brought you to this point? You know, what inspired your work in Ferguson? What did you observe there? How did that lead to Freedom Square? And, you know, what kind of lessons do you bring to the work now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am an artist, I'm a playwright and a poet, and my writing has always been political, but I didn't really consider myself an organizer or an activist. And the summer of 2014, my brother and I were working on a rap project. He and I were a brother-sister rap duo called April Fools. There's still some videos on YouTube you can find. But we had been invited by Victory Gardens Theater.
Your mother's name April, right?
Yeah, my mother's name is April. Her birthday is April Fool's Day. We're very clever. So we were April Fools. We are April Fools, but we just haven't written any raps in a long time. And so we were working on this hip hop one-act hybrid play at Victory Gardens Theater called Lack on Lack, which was both meant to evoke the mythology of Black on Black crime and kind of explode that as a myth, and also explore the intersections of scarcity and how scarcity engineers all of these other forms of oppression, but like light and funny and hip hop and rap and poems. And so we were gaining a lot of traction with this project. We were on the cover of the Red Eye, and we were building this artistic platform. And then Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, and all of our anti-oppression raps felt really trite and not enough. And so I wanted to know like how we could use our artistic platform to amplify the moment, and reached out to organizers in Ferguson and said, hey, what can we do? And they said, we need gas masks. And so that was kind of the beginning of relationship building between a collective of artists that, you know, at the time was not the Let Us Breathe Collective, but through sustained and continued relationship building with protesters in Ferguson became the Let Us Breathe Collective. And we are really about using our platform as artists to incubate visionary imagination around what is possible for society. We believe that artists are the vanguard of revolution, that you can't have a more liberated society if you can't first envision it and imagine it. And so we use artistic interventions in political education and mutual aid to politicize folks and to amplify abolitionist ideology. And so that you know, started before Ferguson, but I think the moment of Ferguson really galvanized us into actual organizing work and brought us into community with the, you know, Chicago organizers who have been at this fight way longer than we have. And then, yeah, you know, Brown Friday or Black Friday of 2014, we rebranded that for Mike Brown as Brown Friday, and that was the beginning of us making the connections between police violence and capitalism, and calling for folks to, you know, stop spending and recognize that like policing protects property, and that police showing out in force to protect Michigan Avenue while harming Black bodies is, you know, an absolute example of why they need to be dismantled and defunded, because they are not here for the protection of life. And so I think we see now, fast forward 6 years later, folks turning up on Michigan Avenue and not just, you know, boycotting the stores, but like breaking the glass in the stores, right? And so I think that critique has become even sharper and more crystallized in this moment, that the destruction of property is not just random, that it is a strategic strike back against a system that prioritizes material goods and property over life.
Yeah, there have been some really interesting kind of videos on social media about just folks on the street being asked, what's the connection between breaking things and, you know, burning down your own community and being angry at police violence? And this one woman was like, these stores are not our stores. The Gap doesn't belong. You know, I mean, she was like breaking this myth that people are sort of mindless mobs or something like that. And of course, in a thing-centered culture where, you know, we spend our whole lives being told that having things is important, and then people are prevented from having things. When the rules break down, obviously, you know, people are going to take things, and that's part of what's happening. And, you know, it's certainly not scripted, but it is, and I remember this, you know, from the Detroit Rebellion of 1967. It certainly is not unrelated to a kind of political dissatisfaction and an understanding of the economic inequality that keeps things from some people and allows other people to hoard things, which is what wealth inequality is, really. Let me turn to you, Trina. You didn't tell us about Freedom Square. We might come back to that, Kristiana, because I think that was an important chapter too. When people think of, particularly in Chicago, I've been on a lot of national conversations, but the history of the struggle around police violence in Chicago is really a long one. And maybe you or Renee, you know, we can come back to that. The Burge torture scandal, the not only the Laquan McDonald case, but the Holman Square case and so forth. So there's so many episodes. Trina, talk to us a little bit about your work, because each of you does really interesting work that is both dismantling, analyzing, exposing some of the problems that we're confronted. I was really moved, as so many people, you had to have Kleenex in your exhibition space when you did the exhibit about the murder of Harith Augustus. I think it was a little over a year ago. Invisible Institute, which you work with, and you put together an exhibit that looked at the kind of forensics of a police murder, showing us who is where, what kind of assumptions are people making when this awful tragedy was about to unfold. Can you say a little bit about the work of the Invisible Institute and that case in particular? Because that was another episode.
Yes, of course. So I really want to ground the work of the Invisible Institute in the name of Diane Bond. She's a Black woman who was living in Stateway Gardens, and she was assaulted by a squad of police officers. And she attempted to file a complaint against the Chicago Police Department, those officers. And she was friends with my executive director now, Jamie Calvin, who essentially put her in touch with Craig Futterman, who then sued the city of Chicago for a settlement for her. But in the process of that, we gained access to all of the disciplinary records of police officers going back to 1967. And from that data, one thing I'd like to highlight is that police officers, people are paid settlements as a result of police misconduct on a regular basis, and it's quite a bit of money. And a lot of times, I think even when we're talking about the Chicago police budget, we're not even thinking about the money that the city is forced to pay out because of their police misconduct. My next piece would be about the complaints. So the Invisible Institute created a database called the Citizens Police Data Project, where you can literally look up your neighborhood, your police district. You can look up your community area, and you can see all the disciplinary history of police officers in that location, and it'll show you complaints, like times where people came to the state and they said, "Hey, we have been done wrong by this police officer or this group of police officers," and then it shows whether or not the complaint was sustained, and then whether or not discipline happened. And from the Citizens Police Data Project, you can literally see the history of impunity at the hands of the Chicago Police Department. I believe between 2011 and 2016, there were over 28,000 allegations of police misconduct, but there were only 715 of them, or 55 of them that were sustained. And then sustained meaning the acknowledged by the entity that investigated them as actually happening. And then when you looked into the discipline, you would see that much of the discipline that happened when police officers did receive a sustained complaint was a reprimand, which is a slap on the wrist, or many times they resigned before they were able to face discipline. This act of resigning reminds me of Rekia Boyd, who was murdered by an off-duty police officer, Dante Servant, in the city of Chicago. Rekia Boyd, BYP 100, this is a campaign that I worked on with BYP 100 before, working at the Invisible Institute, went to the Chicago Police Department headquarters on 35th and Michigan, to the police board hearings where Lori Lightfoot was actually the president, and demanded that they institute a firing process of Dante Servant. He was undercharged by the state's attorney's office, and so he wasn't found guilty of murdering, of involuntary manslaughter of Rekia Boyd. And then because of that loophole, he was able to keep his job. As he was about to get a firing hearing, in response to the pressure that BYP 100 applied onto the Chicago Police Board, he was able to resign and keep his pension. After working on the Say Her Name campaign, that's when I really got into the Invisible Institute, because I wanted to think about ways that our individual narratives are connected to a much larger pattern in the city of Chicago and frankly across the country. Through data analysis, you're able to see the mirage of ways that police officers are able to not be held accountable. That includes like the FOP contract that literally explicitly says that police officers are able to change their statements. We also talk to young people through the Youth Police Project about how they feel about the police without inserting any kind of like any information that we already have access to. We ask them about how they feel about the police, and many of them are already police abolitionists without the language of it, because at the end of the day, their relationship with the police has frankly always been one of police harassing them, handcuffing them, raids on their homes when they were young people, which has significantly traumatized them over time since those moments, and also just like harassment in their schools on a regular basis. And what kind of work we do at the Invisible Institute is we talk to whistleblowers who have inside information about what's going on within the Chicago Police Department in order to report on that. Something called the Code of Silence, a article called the Code of Silence came out that spoke about a police officer and his crew basically running a drug ring in a public housing complex. And since that piece has come out, at least 66 Black men have been exonerated. But we know that there are far more people who should be exonerated and who have been wrongfully convicted and have been murdered by the Chicago Police Department, and there has been no justice for them. Harith Augustus was murdered last year, I think in July. He was a barbershop. He was a barber, I'm sorry. And he honestly always had a gun with him because he works in a cash business. He did not have a conceal carry card, but he did have a FOIA card. Now, when he walked past the police officers on 71st and Jeffrey that day, police officers saw him. They immediately saw that he had a gun, even in a concealed carry state. And as he had his wallet in his hand and was showing them that he had a FOIA card, he ended up being murdered by police officers, by a white man. Even while there were 2 seasoned Black officers who were there at the time. And what that tells us is that not only policing is not necessarily about like we need more white officers, we need more Black officers, or we need more officers of color. That moment really told us that whenever police officers are in a situation where someone makes a decision to shoot and kill someone, they are all going to make a decision as a unit to hold each other down and to essentially tell the same narrative of Harith Augustus had a gun and therefore he deserved to be murdered. Now, Invisible Institute partnered with Forensic Architecture, who is an architectural firm in London, who basically uses architectural software to recreate human rights violations. We were able to talk to neuroscientists to talk about the process, the thinking behind when the officer made the decision to shoot. We were able to interview another person who was there, who witnessed the shooting. We were able to talk to members of the community about Aretha Augustus. And we were also able to analyze specific policy that was not implemented that I believe is really related to our efforts to defund, our efforts being community organizers' efforts to defund police. All officers had a body camera on that day, the day that they shot Aretha Augustus. And according to CPD policy, they're supposed to turn on their body cameras with anytime they have an investigatory stop. What we saw that day, when 5 police officers were under the impression that someone had a weapon and they weren't supposed to have.
We may get Trina back in just a minute. If not, I might turn to Renee to ask a question. But you know, that the forensic project that she's talking about is one. It took surveillance cameras and body cam information from all different angles, looking at how people moved in that situation right before Aretha Augustus was murdered, and the kind of body language of both fear and suspicion when he had really committed no crime, and you could just see a set of assumptions unfolding in the actions of the police. And I was really reminded of Mariam Kaba's statement, you know, where she said, you know, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you're trained to use force, if you're trained in a way that kind of criminalizes communities, then you're going to act in a certain way, which is not a compassionate way, it's not given the benefit of the doubt kind of way. And that's what we see in these different cases. I want to eventually come back around, and maybe this might be that point, to link this to economics and social class, because that sometimes gets left out of the equation. And I know Renee thinks about this in her work on cooperatives. But before we go there, I wanted to ask you, Renee, as a lawyer, as somebody who's done, you know, civil and human rights law, you used to work with the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights under the law. You know, what do you say about this larger question of a human rights frame vis-a-vis police violence? And I say that mindful of Chicago being one of the places that has utilized the United Nations Commission Against Torture as a site for raising issues. The We Charge Genocide delegation from Chicago, and I think it was 2013 maybe, or 2014, that took the case of police violence in Chicago to the United Nations and framed it as a violation, you know, of human rights. Any thoughts about this bigger picture of how we see this from the point of view of human rights in the law?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we have to make those connections, right? So you mentioned the 2014 delegation that took the instances of police torture, which has a very long and now somewhat documented history, but not obviously fully documented history here in the city of Chicago, particularly the torture under John Burge, who was a commander who essentially directed a lot of police officers to commit torture and, you know, was instrumental in kind of maintaining a culture of torture. And in the wake of him actually leaving the police force and folks calling some of this out, and through a lot of organizing and a lot of folks who were really building power around what happened to our folks, you know, there was a policy shift to establish a torture injury relief commission here in the state of Illinois. I did some volunteer work for that, and you read these stories of torture, I mean, that go from everything from throwing people out of the windows to get them to admit to crimes that they didn't commit, to putting people in meat lockers, to, I mean, the stories of torture were so horrendous and heinous. But also we know that they happen every day, right? And you know, to a lesser extent. But in thinking about the human rights framework, I think it's important, just I think today or yesterday, you know, every single country on the African continent charged the UN to hear testimony about police violence and killings in the United States by Black bodies, the killing of Black bodies. And I think that's really important for us to think about this from an internationalist perspective. But then also just recognizing that the police have always been tied to control and persecution, and particularly of Black bodies, and thinking about the establishment of police through the slave patrols to quashing labor protests in northern cities. We know that the police have always been tied to this idea of exploiting labor and bodies of people to produce profit. And that continues, and it kind of transforms in different ways, right, to protect private property. And now we see, I think, a lot of targeting police is really about, this, the additional labor force, the unused labor force that our society has tried to throw away. But then more importantly, we see all the connections between state violence and state-sanctioned economic violence, right? We know that police are used to gentrify communities. We know that the communities that have been most exploited in this community are the same communities that have been targeted by police. We know that asset forfeiture has been used to fund cities through petty fines and fees, and so in thinking about these cases, or talking about things like police video cameras, and I feel like we're talking at the margins, right? We should be thinking so far beyond the type of society and the type of communities that we want to create, where there wouldn't even be those interactions between police and someone who's just going to the barbershop to do his job, basically. And we also see the connections between police killings and basically Black folks trying to access the informal economy. We saw that with Eric Gardner, who was reportedly selling loose cigarettes, and Alton Sterling, who was selling CDs outside of a convenience store and was killed by the police. To a lesser extent, I think we saw that with George Floyd, who we know was unemployed and looking for a second job and providing security at this nightclub or bar, which also seems to be the way in which he knew the police ultimately killed him. So I think that we have to more explicitly make those connections between economic violence, right? That is perpetrated by the state, and also state-sanctioned violence, because they are compounding structures. We know that one is just put in place to serve the other, to make profit off of communities who are seen as throwaway communities. And then I think it also, in thinking about some of the solutions, just really quickly, I think that when we talk about abolition, and we talk about, some people call it defunding the police, but I think in terms of like abolitionist visioning, really is not only about the undoing of police, but it's also about the redoing of society, right? And that essentially means thinking about new types of structures and dreams and institutions that actually will serve our communities, that are controlled by our communities. And that's why I think really building an alternative economy goes hand in hand with actually defunding the police. It's not just we want to invest a little bit more in social services and take some money away from the police. We need a fundamentally different kind of economy, right? That we know doesn't exploit people and also gives people more control over their communities and self-determination of their lives, right? And so I think that is a part of the abolitionist visioning, right? I think we see that, for example, with Freedom Square here in Chicago, which was meant to bring attention to Homan Square. That was basically a Black site where they were taking Black folks to torture them and question them outside of our police stations, right? But was also a project about visioning a different kind of society where people would engage differently and have what they need, and really around concepts of cooperation and mutual aid. And I think we see that, for example, now in Seattle with the autonomous zone, right? Which really some folks are calling a no-cop co-op, in the sense that people are coming together collectively to try to create the kinds of resources and needs that people, will need access to just to live and to thrive outside of any kind of police force, including what we would see as like a new vision for our safety and for our well-being, and trying to do that amongst the actual residents themselves, and not trying to police every single issue that we know we've done and divest from all of the resources that we need. So I think both in terms of the problem, right, and in those who articulate, those that are most impacted, which have been Black bodies, right, in this country around policing, as they articulate the problem and create the solutions, I think that we're seeing that what we really need is a true vision for abolition of police, and then recreation and reimagining of our economic structures, as well as our society structures, really to get to the kind of world that we want to live in, but basically one that is does not steeped in anti-Blackness and the same kind of racist outcomes that we've seen since the beginning of this country.
I think one of the things that makes me hopeful, so the, political theorist Antonio Gramsci has this notion of interregnum, which is, when the old thing has passed away, but the new thing has not yet been born. And it can be a difficult place. But one thing I'm hopeful about with this generation of activists is I do see people creating alternatives at the same time that they're seeking to transform and dismantle. Restorative justice movement is an example of that. It does not respond to it is not expansive enough yet to respond to every instance of harm, but it is a powerful alternative that embodies accountability and deep thinking about how we can keep people safe and nurture each other and heal and all of that. And the cooperative work you do, can you just say a couple sentences about co-ops and solidarity economies as concrete ways of building? And I know there's food co-ops, worker co-ops, community gardens, public land trust. I mean, all of this is a different way of organizing resources rather than the extractive economy of racial capitalism, which is really, it's an infinite growth economy on a very finite planet. And that is a wall that many capitalist expansionists are up against in this moment. But co-ops are an alternative to that. Just give us a couple sentences, and then I want to bring Jamila Woods into the conversation.
Yeah, so quickly. So co-ops really are just enterprises or businesses. They don't necessarily have to even, be profit driven, but a lot of them are. But basically what they do is they center businesses around the needs of people and community, right? And in the constraints of the planet, right? What we know are limited resources, and particularly as we move closer and closer in the climate crisis, or as we push ourselves more to the brink, I should say. But solidarity economy, again, too, is really just this idea that what we need to do is start today about making institutions that are in service of the needs and thriving of communities, right, and the planet. And people have been doing this work, and they a lot of times will start with what is missing. Worker co-ops are a large part of that, but also things like participatory budgeting, thinking about people's assemblies, which I know is really, again, another way in which we can allow more people to more meaningfully participate than asking them to go to the polls every couple of years to make the choice between or to do harm reduction, I think, which is a lot of what we've seen for Black folks in terms of electoral power. But recreating our institutions, our businesses, our organizations in ways that are more democratic, that center the needs of solidarity and sustainability, and really anti-racism, and dealing with issues of patriarchy and imperialism and ableism. And so thinking about how we put different principles fundamentally into everything that we do that allows more people to thrive and to participate, and taking out the profit motive in our economy. And so people are doing this work right now. There's really wonderful stuff that's happening here in the city of Chicago around solidarity economy. One example is Shy Fresh Kitchen, which is a workers co-op that provides meals that's run by primarily Black women who have experienced, who have been incarcerated or who have had experiences with the carceral system, and now have built this workers co-op to not only provide for themselves, right, in ways that they actually own their job and make decisions for it, but also have really showed up for community in different ways. So, for example, they are donating hundreds of meals right now to Juneteenth celebrations and looking for ways to be in solidarity with a lot of the political organizing and grassroots organizing that's happening on the ground. And so that's just one example, but there's so many different kinds of co-ops and Co-op for Lib here in the city of Chicago doing really great work around activating people about Black co-op histories and how we can use those strategies and institutions really to transform the economy in the ways that we need as we seek to abolish the police as well, and really center our communities for safety and for well-being and to thrive ultimately.
Right. Yeah, I wanted the economics piece because sometimes we just talk generally about, Black communities or Black victims of police violence, but disproportionately prisons and jails are filled with not Black college professors, not Black lawyers, not Black millionaires, but Black poor and working class people. And that's, it's very specific in that regard. And people who are in the informal economy are the most vulnerable. People who are homeless are the most vulnerable. People who are housing insecure, people who've been incarcerated. So we don't all have the same level of vulnerability, which is why economic interventions and solutions are so important, and to think beyond a sort of capitalist mindset. I just want to ask Kristiana and Trina, maybe very quickly before we turn to Jamila, to talk about and then show us a little of her transformative art. What are some of the demands on the table here in Chicago? I know both of you have been not only involved in feeding people and mutual aid, but also have been involved in some of the protests in the street. I know that Kristiana and I think Trina also were doing jail support for some of the protesters that were arrested. We also know in other cities around the country, Minneapolis city council has decided to or committed to moving to defund the police. LA has reduced police funding. New York has reduced police funding. Police have been pulled out of the schools in several cities. So many changes seem to be happening very quickly. Some of them hopeful, some of them Band-Aid. What are the kind of demands that are on the table for the city of Chicago right now?
Yeah, absolutely. The primary demand is the defunding of the police. And I just want to really emphasize that in some of the national media conversations, defunding and reform are being used interchangeably. And reform really is the enemy. It is a way to get more funding for the police in the form of training and more surveillance. And we have seen over and over again that those types of reforms do not keep us safe. And so when we talk about defunding, we're talking about reducing police budgets significantly that are right now exponentially larger than things like mental health services or housing services, and reinvesting those funds into those types of resources that do keep communities safe. So reinvesting the overblown police budgets into housing services, homeless services, mental health and addiction treatment, education, things like that. Also, we are demanding CPD out of CPS, that Chicago Public Schools cut ties with CPD, stopping the plans of building the $95 million cop academy. Trina, you want to add anything to that?
Absolutely. I think on the way towards abolition, because the end goal is always abolition, is that we need to end pretrial holding. We believe that it's unconstitutional, and that it honestly disproportionately impacts Black and brown people. We need to revisit this FOP contract negotiations and quite literally remove and change the way that arbitration happens between the city and the Fraternal Order of Police. It is very clear from within their contract that they are given quite a bit of leeway that operate as barriers for accountability. We believe that settlements should be addressed. The city of Chicago pays out settlements, and typically when the city of Chicago pays out settlements, that is not only money that is paid from the state, but also police officers are not facing accountability because of settlements. Police officers need to be hit in their pockets and through their pensions if they are involved in a settlement. in a case that results in a settlement, you can find data on settling for misconduct through the Chicago Reporter. You can literally read narratives of people and literally see that there are repeat police officers who have thousands and thousands of dollars attached to their names, all money that the city pays out, all while they are able to retain their job and retain their pension. We need to, my last thing about the FOP contract is because that is currently, they're currently in conversation about that right now, is that there needs to be a change in the way that people who are filing complaints against police officers in the city of Chicago have to file affidavits. So when someone has an encounter with the police and they report it to the system, to what should be CPAC, in my personal opinion, or something like CPAC, it is required that not only the person who is reporting it shows their name, but also that police officers are able to see the evidence before they can talk about, before they can address that allegation. And the process is incredibly unfair. And again, all of this is on the way towards abolition. We need to think about policy that is reducing the power and introducing alternative first responders who are not required to report to police officers. That means specifically around sexual assault. No police officer should be engaging with someone who has just experienced sexual assault. Like people who have experienced sexual assault should be engaged with a clinician who is able to who is able to gather a report without pressing the survivor to press charges against the person who has violated them. I think that there are many sacred things that the police are currently a part of, including, and it's not only limited to sexual assault survivors, that we need to introduce alternative first responders to, who are not in relationship with and are not mandated to report to police, because we know that underreporting is happening rampantly, and a lot of times underreporting is happening because of the relationship with reporting and police.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to add something to that real quick, Barbara. When we think about defunding, I think it really means like reimagining the infrastructure that we respond to emergencies with. So, 911 is a national hotline, and you have kind of three options of what you're going to get when you dial 911: an ambulance, a fire truck, or police. And imagine if instead, when you dial 911, you could get a sexual violence trauma counselor in the same amount of time, in a minute or 2 minutes to your door, or you could get a domestic violence specialist to your door in the same amount of time, or you could get food services or housing services. If we can build, an app like Uber where you can like order a car on your phone and have it there in a few minutes, if we invest those same kinds of resources in emergency response infrastructure that does not prioritize people with guns and people with militarized training and people who are showing up ready to be violent, we can really have a myriad of responses. And that's the type of visionary, imaginative thinking that I think is going to move us forward towards abolition.
Absolutely. I want to add one more thing to that.
We need to shift to Jamila, who's been waiting so patiently to get in. So one quick point, Trina, and then we're going to shift. Trina?
Oh, I just wanted to ground us in the fact that in March, Lori Lightfoot put out housing relief she said a $1,000 housing relief for 2,000 applicants who lost their income due to COVID-19, and over 83,000 people applied. We know that people are in dire need of housing security, and that is a demand today. That's something that can't wait. When eviction, we need an eviction moratorium. We need to provide support to people who are essentially right on the doorstep of facing an eviction of their homes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, the fact that we don't have enough time to list all the things that need to be done speak to the scope and scale of the problem. But I think the other thing that makes me hopeful is the vastness of our heart and our heads and our determination and our imagination. And I think that's a good segue to bring Jamila Woods into the conversation, one of Chicago's treasures, a award-winning poet, an amazing vocalist and artist, an arts education teacher who's won all kinds of awards. And when I tell people I know her, they, it's like, Jamila Woods, that's amazing. So we're happy you're here with us today. We are happy you're on our side. And I wanted to ask you, before we ask you to share some of your songs, just to talk a little bit about your connection to social justice and racial justice work, because much of your art, like Kristiana's, speaks to the question of injustice and the hopefulness of change. So how do you kind of see your art responding to some of the issues that we've been talking about?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and to all of you for sharing. I really enjoyed being a part of this conversation. I think for me, most recently, I've found a lot of comfort and inspiration in reading work by Black writers, Black thinkers who have been Black artists who have been thinking about these things. And it's affirming to see that, they're saying the same things that we're saying, and also gives me hope to see the things that are different, like you were talking about restorative justice and things that are new. And I think it's really important to be grounded in the history, because there is a lot of repackaging and gaslighting of Black people. This is progress, this is what change looks like, when really it's the same things in a new package. So a lot of my songs that I was going to share today, I did a project with each song named after a writer or thinker who gives me affirmation. And I think it is really important to be mindful of taking care of ourselves, because it's a long game. And so to be sustainable in the work, something that's important to me is remembering my worth, and just having that kind of spiritual center. And I think there's a Nikki Finney quote that I really like, where she's talking about, I will not allow brutality of white supremacy to affect how I ultimately feel, how I open my eyes in the morning, or how I close them at night. And I think a lot of what helps me with that is returning to the words of ancestors or elders.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. You were an Africana Studies major, right? And also
Yes.
theater major, yeah. So you've thought about this a lot. Tell us a little. You're going to tell us a little bit about the songs you're going to perform, or can I ask you about Black Girl Soldier, because that's one that really kind of comes out of a very explicit political moment, right?
Yes, I wasn't gonna perform that one, but
Okay,
I
but can
can.
you just tell us about it?
But yeah, that one is particularly inspired by the first time that I went to an organizing meeting. It was a BYP 100 meeting following the murder of Rekia Boyd, and that was just something that really kind of activated me, because she was my same age when she was killed, and I was just my first time going into these movement spaces and hearing the chants, and I was just really inspired by seeing Black women at the center of the movement. And just people were talking about how that's always been the case, but it's not always been the case that they're the names that get remembered as these leaders. So just thinking of the ways that Black women have operated in my personal life, but also in these movements, is what inspired that song.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. Well, I think we'll segue now to hear some of the songs that you've prepared for us as a way to close out this conversation of, power and strength and imagination and determination. And kind of in the spirit of appreciating, I just want to appreciate all of you, Renee, Kristiana, Trina, and Essence, who doesn't have her image up, but who is the behind the scenes force in this, as well as Lillian Paniagua, who works with us at the Social Justice Initiative. I'm fortunate to be surrounded by, powerful and amazing young women who I have every confidence will change the world. So let's segue to your music, and we will be so grateful. And then I'll close out with a sentence at the end.
Okay, thank you.
And we should all mute.
See. Okay, cool. All right, so the first song that I'm gonna do is named after Zora Neale Hurston, and it really is just about, after reading her essay where she says, like, I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a sharp white background, just thinking of the expansiveness of Blackness, which I think is something that took me till I was older to really understand and be able to own. And so I think that's so important as we talk about all Black lives mattering. It's just to understand that we are so many things. So this is Zora. Must be disconcerting how I discombobulate the mold. I've always been the only, every classroom, every home. Kiss of chocolate on the moon, collard greens and silver spoon. Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes, they can stick onto me. My weaponry is my energy. I tenderly feel my enemies with white light. You will never know everything, everything. I will never know everything, everything. You will never know everything, everything. And you don't know me, so you up the creek. You will never know everything, everything. I will never know everything, everything. You will never know everything, everything. And you don't know me, couldn't possibly. Oh, 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 ah, oh, 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 ah, oh, ah, oh, 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 ah, oh, oh, ah, oh, ah, oh, 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 ah, oh, oh, ah, oh, ah, oh, 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 ah, oh, oh, ah. None of us are free, but some of us are brave. Dare you to shrink my way. I'm on a new plane, I'm all out of fucks to give. Yay, fear ain't no way to live. Yeah. It must be disconcerting how I discombobulate the mold. I've always been the only. You're so unoriginal. Your words don't leave scars. Believe me, I've heard them all. I may be small, I may speak soft, but you can see the change in the water. Oh, 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 ah, oh, 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 ah, oh, ah. Oh, 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 ah, oh, oh, ah, oh, ah, oh, 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 ah, oh, oh, ah, oh, ah, oh, 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 ah, oh, oh, ah. You will never know everything, everything. I will never know everything, everything. You will never know everything, everything. And you don't know me, so you up the creek. You will never know everything. Everything, and you don't know me, impossible. Said you don't know me. No, you don't know me. You will never know everything, everything. You will never know everything, everything, and you don't know me, couldn't possibly. Thank you. So this next song is called Giovanni, and it's inspired by Nikki Giovanni's poem Ego Trippin'. And yeah, it's ego tripping, pretty self-explanatory. It's about how amazing all of us are, Black women. Go ahead. You might wanna hold my comb when you find out what I'm made of. You might wanna follow me and copy all of my mistakes. You cannot smile when I smile, and I cry. It's just the race so I can grow. Any minute now you get the message. Any minute, money picker. Come on, listen to a quick confession. Water is the oil, me to your aggression. I'm protected. Joy celebrate on me. Mama presage for me. No one can take that energy away from me. I've been up in here since grandmama was a baby. Praise me, I be on my Giovanni, T and honey. Tell it like I see it, speak it so I be it. My ancestors watch me, fairy tale walking, black Goldilocks. Yeah, my nap's just right. You got questions, I know that's right. There must be a reason why. There must be a reason. There must be a reason why. There must be a reason. Little bitty, you wanna call me? 100 motherfuckers can't tell me how I'm supposed to look when I'm angry. How I'm supposed to shrink when you're around me. Permission denied to rearrange me. I am the kingdom, I am not your queen. Hotep, better step from up around me. I'm not your Eve. Any minute now you get the message. Any minute, money pick a app description. I'm impressive. You can check my chart for reference. Mood, sun kiss, rare and blessed. Come on, listen to a quick confession. Water is the oil, me to your aggression. I'm protected. Joy celebrate on me. Mama versage for me. None can take that energy away from me. I've been up in here since grandmama was a baby. Praise me, I be on my Giovanni, T and honey. Tell it like I see it, speak it so I be it. My ancestors watch me, fairy tale walking, black Goldilocks. Yeah, my nap's just right. You got questions, I know that's right. There must be a reason why. There must be a reason. There must be a reason why. There must be a reason. All praises, I am the one who would say, hey, I am so perfect, I'm so divine, can't comprehend me till I tell you how. There must be a reason. There must be a reason why. There must be a reason. There must be a reason why. There must be a reason. There must be a reason why. There must be a reason. There must be a reason why. Thank you. This next song, this last song, could be the last one, is called Holy. So, give me today my daily bread. Help me to walk alone ahead. Though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no love. Oh, my smile, my mind reassure me I don't need no one. Woke up this morning with my mind set on loving me. With my mind set on loving. Woke up this morning with my mind set on loving me. With my mind set on loving. I'm not lonely, I'm alone, and I'm holy by my own. I'm not lonely, I'm alone, and I'm holy may leave, the winter may not. Hey, the map of your palms, the temple you be, you're all that you got. The bad days may come, the lover may leave, the winter may not. The map of your palms, the temple you be, you're all that you got. I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no love. Oh, my smile, my mind reassure me, I don't need no one. Woke up this morning with my mind set on loving me. With my mind set on loving. Woke up this morning with my mind set on loving me. With my mind set on loving. I'm not lonely, I'm alone. I'm holy by my own. I'm not lonely, I'm alone. And I'm holy by my own. My cup is full of what I got is enough. Nobody completes me, don't mess with my stuff. My cup is full of what I got is enough. Nobody completes me, don't mess with my love. Surely, 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 goodness and mercy shall follow me. It's gonna follow me. Shall follow me.
That was amazing. That was absolutely, let's give,
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you.
thank you. What a way to end this conversation. You know, sometimes the work of doing organizing can be draining and difficult and frustrating and confusing. And I think, you know, artists like you give us clarity and strength in ways that you may not even know. So thank you for that. Thank you for your own activism. Thank all of our amazing speakers. This is a program of the Social Justice Initiative at University of Illinois in Chicago. We will have more programs. Thanks to my colleagues, Essence McDowell and Lillian Paniagua. And we will invite you all to be with us next time for this conversation, or we'll see you in another forum where we're all joining together to try to change this city and change the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Essence.